Ladies and gentlemen, listen to me closely. 11 principles that transformed my life in just 1 year. True transformation begins with an understanding of how change actually happens. Not from motivation or willpower alone, but from how the brain and body are designed to function. When I began my journey of transformation, I realized that if I wanted lasting results, I couldn't rely solely on habits or hacks. I needed to understand the underlying biology. That insight led to a shift. Instead of fighting my physiology, I started working with it. This became the foundation of everything. Each principle I adopted was grounded in how the nervous system, hormones, and neural circuits operate. I stopped chasing motivation and started asking, what does the science say about how humans change? And then I applied that with discipline. Let me explain what this looks like in practice. Most people try to change by setting goals or using brute force to will themselves into new behaviors. The problem is that method doesn't respect how your brain is wired. Your brain isn't designed to operate optimally under constant strain without feedback or structure. It's designed to learn through cues, rewards, and consistent input. It's designed to grow and rewire itself when placed under the right conditions. And those conditions can be created intentionally. For example, when I learned about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, I understood that it isn't happening all the time in equal measure. There are windows when it's more available. Early in the day after waking, when levels of neuromodulators like norepinephrine and acetylcholine are naturally elevated, the brain is primed for focus and change. That means if I wanted to reshape my behavior or improve my learning, that early window needed to be treated as sacred. That's not just a productivity science. The early part of the day carries a higher plasticity potential. And when you use that window to practice a skill, solve a problem, or perform focused work, you're reinforcing circuits that will become easier to access later. This understanding helped me prioritize behaviors not based on preference, but on biology. I didn't exercise when I felt like. I scheduled it based on when it would create the strongest physiological impact. I didn't meditate randomly. I did when it would best anchor my autonomic nervous system. That's what biology first change looks like. It's not arbitrary, it's strategic. Another example is the way I approached stress and energy. Instead of avoiding stress, I started learning how to work with it. I used visual tools to widen or narrow my field of view, knowing that it could shift my physiological state. I learned breathing techniques that could elevate or reduce my alertness in seconds, depending on whether I needed to engage or recover. These weren't just relaxation tools. They were ways to take direct control over my internal state. That's not magic. It's mechanistic. The power of this approach is that it's sustainable. When you align your habits with your biology, you don't burn out. You don't feel like you're constantly forcing yourself into things. Change becomes a side effect of working with the natural rhythms of your brain and body, and the effects compound. One change builds on the next because the system is integrated. That's why this principle came first. Everything that followed was only effective because it was grounded in the understanding of how change actually works. If you ignore the biological reality of being human, you set yourself up for resistance. But if you honor it, you create conditions for lasting transformation. It's not always easy, but it is reliable. Real change doesn't begin with ambition. It begins with alignment, with biology, with science, and with systems that work. Once I embraced that, everything else became not just possible, but inevitable. Every meaningful change I experienced in the last year came from deliberately seeking out discomfort, not in a reckless or punishing way, but in a controlled, measured form that allowed my nervous system to adapt. It's easy to think of discomfort as something to avoid. Most people are conditioned to move toward ease, toward comfort, toward whatever feels safest or most familiar. But the human brain is built for challenge. In fact, it thrives on it. Neural circuits don't grow in rest. They grow in tension. They grow under load. Once I understood this, I stopped waiting for comfort to pass before taking action. Instead, I trained myself to move toward controlled discomfort on purpose. That discomfort could take many forms: cold exposure, physical exertion, cognitive strain, emotional vulnerability, or even structured silence. What mattered wasn't the specific type of discomfort. What mattered was that it was chosen and that it was done consistently enough to trigger adaptation. There's a mechanism in the brain called hormesis. It's the idea that short bursts of stress applied in the right dose actually make the system stronger. Cold plunges, high-intensity exercise, public speaking, problem solving under pressure. These are all hormetic stressors when done with intention. What I found was that by exposing myself to one uncomfortable thing every day, my baseline for what I could tolerate began to not just physically and mentally, emotionally. I became more resilient not by avoiding difficulty, but by practicing it in small, deliberate ways. One of the most powerful examples of this was cold exposure. Not because it's trendy or extreme, but because it's one of the simplest, most reliable ways to activate the stress response in a controlled environment. When I stepped into cold water, my heart rate jumped, my breathing changed, and my mind screamed to get out. But instead of panicking, I learned to breathe, to stay, to control my response rather than be owned by it. That practice translated far beyond the ice. It taught me that I could meet stress with awareness instead of reactivity. I also brought this principle into my cognitive life. I would choose work that was mentally demanding and sit with it longer than felt comfortable. No switching tabs, no checking messages, just deep work, even if it felt frustrating or slow. That friction, that resistance, that was where the brain started to rewire itself. Over time, focus improved. Tolerance for mental effort increased. What used to feel exhausting became manageable, even enjoyable. Emotionally, I started having harder conversations. I allowed myself to sit in silence rather than fill every gap with words. I practiced asking for feedback I didn't want to hear. These forms of discomfort are just as important as physical stressors because they stretch the nervous system in different but equally valuable ways. Emotional discomfort, when faced intentionally, creates emotional flexibility, and flexibility is strength. What made all of this work was consistency. It wasn't about chasing adrenaline or proving toughness. It was about signaling to my brain every single day, we can do hard things. That signal builds a new baseline of what you believe you're capable of. It becomes a form of identity. You go from avoiding discomfort to seeking it, not recklessly, but strategically. And once that switch flips, life changes. You no longer fear challenge, you lean into it. Controlled discomfort is a powerful training ground for the nervous system. It teaches the body to regulate stress, the brain to sharpen under pressure, and the mind to stay steady in chaos. In a world that constantly promises ease, choosing discomfort on purpose might seem counterintuitive. But it's exactly that act of going against the grain, of seeking difficulty rather than hiding from it, that leads to growth. Over time, what was once hard becomes normal. What was once avoided becomes mastered. And that transformation happens not in giant leaps, but in small daily doses of chosen discomfort that gradually reshape who you are. One of the most profound shifts I made over the last year was realizing that I could change my internal state, how alert, focused, calm, or energized I felt by using something as simple and immediate as my vision and breath. These two tools, often overlooked because of their simplicity, gave me moment-to-moment control over my nervous system. And when you can control your state, you can control your behavior, your thoughts, and ultimately, your outcomes. The visual system is directly connected to the brain's arousal centers. What this means in practice is that how you use your eyes, what you focus on and how can signal to your brain whether it's time to ramp up or calm down. When I needed to engage in focused work, I narrowed my vision. Literally, I would look at a single point on my screen or desk and avoid shifting my gaze. This narrow, tunnel-like focus triggers the brain's alertness systems, releasing norepinephrine, which increases attention and cognitive engagement. It's not just about concentration, it's biology at work. On the other hand, when I felt overwhelmed, stressed, or scattered, I practiced panoramic vision. I would step outside or even just look around the room without focusing on any one object. This wide-angle view sends a signal to the brain that the environment is safe, and it downregulates the sympathetic nervous system. It was astonishing how quickly this could shift my state, faster than any app, drink, or motivational quote. The ability to switch between these visual modes became a cornerstone of how I managed energy and stress throughout the day. Breathing, too, became a tool, one that I used intentionally, not just something that happened in the background. The breath is one of the only physiological systems that is both automatic and under voluntary control, making it a direct handle on the autonomic nervous system. I began using specific breathing patterns depending on what I needed. One of the most effective was the physiological Psi-2 inhales through the nose, followed by a long exhale through the mouth. Just 1 or 2 rounds of this could reduce stress, lower heart rate, and bring my mind back to center. When I needed to increase alertness, say, before a high-stakes meeting or a cognitively demanding task, I would use rapid nasal inhales followed by slower exhales. This elevated my autonomic arousal in a controlled way, helping me feel ready but not panicked. These weren't random breathing techniques. They were rooted in science, and they worked because they directly influenced carbon dioxide and oxygen levels in the blood, which in turn affect the brainstem centers that regulate alertness and calm. Over time, using vision and breath became my default strategy for self-regulation. Instead of relying on caffeine, willpower, or external stimulation, I relied on internal tools. They were fast, free, and always accessible. This gave me a sense of agency I had never really felt before. It was empowering to know that I didn't have to be a passenger in my own nervous system. I could drive. This control allowed me to recover faster from stress, focus more deeply when it mattered, and wind down more smoothly when it was time to rest. It improved my ability to transition between tasks, shift out of anxiety, and handle unexpected challenges without becoming dysregulated. In essence, it allowed me to become more adaptable. And that's the real value here. Adaptability. The world throws a lot at us, most of which we can't control. But when you have tools like vision and breath that allow you to shift your internal state on demand, you become more resilient. You respond rather than react. You create a buffer between stimulus and response, which is where all your power lies. By mastering something as innate and accessible as how I looked and how I breathed, I unlocked a deeper level of control over my life, not in a rigid or mechanical way, but in a responsive, flexible, and human way. This principle taught me that regulation isn't about suppression. It's about direction. And that makes all the difference. For most of my life, I treated sleep as a passive activity, something that happened between days, not something I prioritized within them. But once I began to understand the role of sleep in the process of transformation, everything changed. Sleep is not just about rest. It's the time when the brain performs some of its most essential functions for learning, memory, recovery, and even emotional regulation. When I started to protect my sleep with the same seriousness I gave to my work or training, the effects were immediate and profound. It became one of the most foundational changes in the entire year. What makes sleep so critical is what happens inside the brain while we're asleep. During deep sleep, the brain literally cleans itself. It flushes out metabolic waste through a process called glymphatic clearance. This isn't metaphorical. It's physical. That waste includes beta, amyloid, and other proteins linked to cognitive decline if left unchecked. Sleep is when the nervous system resets. It's when the brain consolidates memories, strengthens new neural connections, and prunes away the irrelevant ones. This is where real learning happens, not just in the moment of study or effort, but in the recovery period afterward. When I began optimizing sleep, I started with light. The circadian rhythm, the body's internal clock, is regulated primarily by light exposure, especially early in the day. So I made it a non-negotiable to get sunlight into my eyes within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking. No sunglasses, no windows, direct sunlight. This single action helped anchor my sleep-wake cycle. It made it easier to fall asleep at night and wake up feeling alert in the morning. The body and brain crave rhythm. When you align with that natural rhythm, energy levels stabilize, mood improves, and cognitive performance increases. Equally important was limiting artificial light exposure at night. Blue light from screens, especially late in the evening, delays the release of melatonin, the hormone that helps initiate sleep. I began shutting off screens 2 hours before bed. If I had to use devices, I used dim settings or wore blue blocking glasses. It might seem small, but that adjustment made sleep deeper and more restorative. Falling asleep became easier and staying asleep became more consistent. Temperature also played a role. The body naturally cools down as it prepares for sleep. I began cooling my sleep environment, lowering the room temperature slightly, avoiding heavy meals late at night, and taking a warm shower an hour before bed to help drop core body temperature afterward. These physiological cues told my body it was time to transition to rest. Caffeine and alcohol were other critical factors. I stopped caffeine after 2 p.m. as its half-life meant it was still active in my system into the evening. I also cut back on alcohol, which might help some people fall asleep faster but actually disrupts sleep architecture, particularly REM sleep. Once I removed these disruptors, the quality of my sleep improved drastically. I didn't just sleep more, I slept better. And better sleep changed everything. What surprised me most was how much of my daytime performance was actually a reflection of my nighttime habits. My ability to focus, to regulate emotion, to respond rather than react. These were not just mindset issues. They were biochemical and they were rooted in sleep. Once sleep improved, I had more patience, more clarity. I was less impulsive, more consistent, and better able to learn from mistakes. That's not coincidence. That's the nervous system functioning as it's supposed to. Sleep isn't something to squeeze in. It's not the reward for a long day. It's the foundation of the next one. If you neglect it, no productivity strategy, supplement, or mindset shift will hold. But when you protect it, everything gets better. It's not about sleeping more. It's about sleeping better and aligning with the biology that drives true recovery. In the end, optimizing sleep wasn't just a lifestyle change. It was a gateway to the cognitive and emotional transformation I've been chasing all along. At some point, I had to confront a difficult truth. I was spending too much time in consumption mode, absorbing information, scrolling, watching, even reading, while telling myself I was being productive. The reality was I was mentally busy, but not mentally active. There's a massive difference between consuming and creating. One keeps your brain reactive. The other rewires it. And once I understood that, I made a commitment to shift from being primarily a consumer to becoming a creator. This principle changed how I used my mind, how I used my time, and ultimately how I saw myself. Creating doesn't have to mean writing a book or painting a masterpiece. It means generating something from your own mind, ideas, solutions, plans, reflections, expressions. It could be as simple as writing down thoughts each morning, designing a better system for your day, or working through a problem without Googling it immediately. The act of creation activates different circuits in the brain. It forces engagement. It requires synthesis. You can't create passively. You have to be present, and that changes everything. One of the first things I did was introduce a daily writing practice, not for anyone else, just for me. A simple notebook where I captured what I was thinking, feeling, and questioning. This was not journaling for nostalgia or documentation. It was a way to process. Writing forced me to slow down my thoughts and make sense of them. It trained me to think clearly. More importantly, the signals you give it gave me a direct feedback loop. I could look at what I'd written yesterday and ask, is this still true? Do I still believe this? That ongoing self-inquiry made me sharper and more honest. I also began tackling problems by thinking them through myself first, before consulting outside sources. That alone boosted confidence and cognitive resilience. It's easy to become dependent on inputs, search engines, videos, podcasts, so much so that we forget how capable we are of original thought. But the brain, like any muscle, strengthens with use. Creating is one of the most direct ways to exercise that muscle. It brings challenge and with it, neuroplasticity. The shift toward creating also applied to how I approached conversations. Instead of reacting with preloaded opinions or references, I tried to respond with what I actually thought in the moment, even if it wasn't polished. That made me more present, more honest, and more connected. It also revealed where I needed to grow. When you speak your own thoughts rather than repeating others, you quickly find the gaps in your understanding. And those gaps are gold. They show you where to direct your learning. That said, this principle isn't about rejecting consumption altogether. It's about ratio. I still learn from others, but now I do it with intent. I ask, how will I use this? What will I create from this? If the answer isn't clear, I pause, because the goal isn't to collect ideas like trophies. It's to integrate them, apply them, and make them your own. True understanding only comes from expression. There's also a physiological benefit to creating. When you bring something into the world, an idea, a plan, a piece of writing, your brain rewards you. Dopamine is released, not just from achievement, but from the act of forward motion. Creation gives you momentum. It gives you a sense of agency, and that sense of agency is critical for long-term motivation. Over time, the act of creating became part of my identity. I stopped seeing myself as someone who passively absorbed life and started seeing myself as someone who shaped it. That shift brought clarity, energy, and purpose. It made me more selective about how I spent my time. It made me less reactive and more intentional. And it made me realize that the life I wanted wasn't something I would find. It was something I had to build. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It started with small, consistent acts of creation. Thinking for myself, writing things down, speaking up, solving problems without crutches. Over time, those acts rewired my brain, rewired my identity, and redefined my life. One of the most transformative realizations I had this year was that discipline not something you are born with. It's something you train. And more importantly, it's not about being harsh, rigid, or forcing yourself into action through sheer willpower. Real discipline is built through structure, repetition, and consistency. It's about making decisions ahead of time so that when the moment comes, the path is already laid out. Once I began to understand and apply this, I stopped waiting to feel ready, and I started building systems that removed the need for constant internal negotiation. Discipline is not about motivation. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings are unreliable. They fluctuate depending on sleep, stress, nutrition, hormones, environment, and 100 other factors. Waiting for motivation to act is like waiting for the weather to be perfect before going outside. It might happen, but you won't build anything lasting that way. So I stopped relying on feelings to guide my actions. Instead, I focused on behaviors, especially small ones, repeated consistently at the same time each day. That consistency became the foundation of trust with myself. When you do what you say you're going to do, even when you don't feel like it, that's how self-respect is built. Early in this journey, I decided to give each day a scaffolding, a set of non-negotiables that would happen no matter what. Not many, just a few. Morning light exposure, 10 minutes of writing, movement. These were anchor points. They created a sense of order in the chaos. And more importantly, they were controllable. I didn't need external validation, money, or equipment to do them. That made them immune to excuse. And once those anchors were in place, it became easier to add more structure. Mel times, deep work blocks, recovery windows. The day wasn't rigid, but it was stable. And that stability gave me freedom. Discipline also meant limiting options. Most people think freedom is having unlimited choice. But in practice, too much choice leads to decision fatigue, which erodes willpower and drains cognitive energy. So I simplified. I chose what I would wear, when I would work, what I would eat, and how I would train ahead of time. These weren't mindless routines. They were mental shortcuts that preserved energy for things that actually mattered. It's not automation for laziness. It's automation for clarity. There were days when I didn't want to follow through, when I felt resistance, when the mind started bargaining. That's when I learned the most powerful part of discipline. You don't want to do something to do it. You just need to begin. Action changes state. I found that just starting, was 90% of the battle. A 5-minute walk often turned into 30. A 10-minute writing session often unlocked insights I wasn't expecting. I learned not to trust the voice that said, "Do it later." I learned to move anyway. The cumulative effect of daily discipline is massive, but it's quiet. It doesn't feel dramatic in the moment. It's not fireworks. It's bricks. One brick laid perfectly, then another, then another. And over time, that structure becomes a fortress. It protects you when life gets chaotic. It keeps you grounded when everything else is unstable because you've trained yourself to show up. Discipline also created space for spontaneity. It sounds paradoxical, but it's true. When the foundation is solid, you can improvise without falling apart. You can take a day off, travel, shift things around because you know the core is intact. You don't lose momentum, you just flex around it. That flexibility is earned through structure. Ultimately, discipline taught me that freedom isn't the absence of constraints. It's the ability to direct your life with precision. It's knowing that your habits work in your favor, even when your feelings don't. It's the confidence that comes from knowing you can count on yourself. And once that's in place, everything else becomes easier. Not because life gets easier, but because you do.